it's hard to go into your own head and be like, X, Y, and Z in my relationships isn't going right, and like I need to figure out how to make those things better.
Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man? What what had like is it something you think about in your day to day, like as something that interests you, like your perspective on masculinity or how it's impacted your life or identity? Like does it how frequently, I guess, do you think about it? Does it matter to you, basically?
Let's say honestly, I don't think about it on a regular basis. Like, and I wouldn't consider myself like an exceptionally masculine person, or guy. So I don't really. I feel like it's not a part of my day to day. Really,
Yeah.
like when it becomes a part of my thinking is when I'm doing something social, or I'm at a bar and I see someone who's exhibiting masculine traits that like annoy me or piss me off. Like we've all been at a bar with the dude who's like trying to be macho, and it's like one of the most annoying things.
Yeah.
Uh, so in that regard, it does, but otherwise, like it hasn't really been like a central part of like my day to day or my thinking. It's something that I don't really think about all that regularly.
Yeah. And you mentioned um like exhibiting masculine traits, and uh you wrote that like your definition of masculinity is more of like the provider role versus like a physical attributes or stature kind of trait. So um why is that provider role important to you as your like definition of masculinity, and how do you think it might differ from like the broader societal definitions?
Good question. I mean, I think that's just the way that it sort of masculinity um was realized like in my household. That's sort of like the role that my dad took on, basically. And I think like there's so many different definitions of masculinity, right? When I say like provider, like I don't necessarily mean providers as much as it is like, you know, going into every situation sort of of head on and with like a competent confidence. And sometimes I think like where toxic masculinity kind of rears its head is when like I think like sort of bravado and like displays of power can sometimes like masquerade as competent confidence, and people who don't sort of have the competent confidence try to like make up for it with like bravado and power. And so
Mhm.
I feel like my dad did a really good job of sort of showing me like what it meant to just like handle yourself as a human being. Not to say that my mom didn't either. It's just like we're talking about masculinity, so I'm going to bring up my dad rather than my mom. But
Yeah.
um, his way of putting my sister and I and our family in a good position was just like you know approach everything with sort of a competent confidence, and like don't be too outspoken, just like handle your business.
Hmm.
And so that's sort of like what I internalize is like what a father figure or like the masculine presence in my life kind of does.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've heard that, but I like it. The confident competence is a good blend of like strength that's not flashy, but actually represents something internal. I think it's a good distinction. And is, like you said, often covered up with louder, more outward displays uh, of that confidence that may or may not represent like more of an internal competence. Like it may be missing, and maybe a cover up, and like you said, could get annoying to people interacting with that in the general public. Um, I guess from going from there, like with that competent confidence, do you have avenues or feel comfortable asking for help? Like, what do you do? Or have maybe you've seen mentors ask for help or lean on other people. So what does asking for help or leaning on someone else look like in that kind of character trait?
Well, I mean, I think the nature of like making yourself so vulnerable that you have to ask for help is like it can be construed as not masculine or weakness, but like I personally would take that as a showing of strength. Um, because not everyone can know everything and be great at everything, and someone who eventually strives to be great at everything, you have to start from somewhere, and so making yourself vulnerable to ask questions, I actually view as like a huge plus, personally. Uh, but I can see why a lot of people who don't, you know, some people would think that's something that makes you vulnerable, and I think I'm lucky enough to have been put in environments that sort of encourage asking questions and like making yourself aware of what you don't know, because the only way to learn more and become knowledgeable is like isolate the things you don't know and then learn them. And how are you going to do that? Like find someone who knows them better than you, and making yourself vulnerable and say I need help. And
Yep.
so asking for help has always been something like, I guess I'm approaching this sort of like from like a work or sports or that kind of thing. Like a but I mean I wouldn't say on a regular basis I ask for like emotional help. I think emotional vulnerability is kind of something separate from what I was just talking about. Um and that's a whole nother ballgame. And that's like that's like a hard thing to do, because it's like it's much easier to diagnose like if at work or at sports like you're lacking somewhere. Like it's really easy to point out like you're playing basketball, like my jumper sucks. Like it's hard to go into your own head and be like, X, Y, and Z in my relationships isn't going right. And like I need to figure out how to make those things better. That's a really difficult thing to do and takes a lot of like self-reflection. And so I try. I try to be good at that stuff and make an honest account of how like things in my personal life are going and how I can improve them. But I
Hmm.
wouldn't say asking for help is like a normal part of that procedure. And I
Yeah.
don't really even know how. I mean, I like besides therapy, I don't know how one would really do that. Besides if you have a romantic partner, sort of having really um frank conversations with each other,
Mhm.
or friends, which I think like happens pretty rarely.
Yeah.
It's probably easier to do with a romantic partner than like your guy friends. I mean, that's like I don't know if I've ever really had a conversation like if my friends and I are having like on a rocky period, which like I don't even know what that means, but like that stuff definitely happens. Like you can get in a rhythm with your friends or in and out of rhythms with your friends, and it's pretty rare, I think, to be like, what's happening? What's going on with this like friendship relationship? Probably something that like we should all do more of. Um, but when I'm with like if instances like that arise with my friends, you kind of just like brush it under the rug until things are fine again.
Hmm.
Um, with a romantic partner, I think things like bubble up to the surface, and you kind of have to have those conversations. Um, so I think like there's two different asking for help in like practical things is different than asking for help emotionally, and it's hard. Like it's much easier to do the former than the latter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I completely agree with the distinction. And as you were talking, I was kind of taking stock of like where I ask for help too. And it for sure aligns more with things that have more measurable and achievable goals, because asking for help makes more sense in that context where like I don't know how to do something and I'm trying to get to this goal. Obviously, I'm going to ask someone who knows X, Y, or Z for help in that area, and it's going to help me get to this point. Um, and it's a common trend with a lot of guys I talk to that the romantic partner in a heterosexual relationship often takes on some of the role of like the emotional, like asking for help route. Um,
Mhm.
and it's very often not the case that it's in male friend groups, and um, it's something that I think is like a helpful practice. Lots of awkward starts. I know, like our friend group, my friend group from home, we've tried to. There's been a few different like check-ins and like see how the boys are doing kind of thing, and
Yeah.
it started off feeling forced and awkward. We got a little better at it, but it's still like few and far between. um but I think it is really nice to have that route, and just it's one of the main like complaints and concerns a lot of the guys we talk to have is like, I can't really think of many confidants I would call with like a emotional burden. And like for me, a lot of the times it's like if I were to pick up the phone to call someone about like a relationship or a friendship challenge, it would probably be my sisters. And that just like it just feels more natural. But it would be cool to have like if it's about something with my friends, to like be able to do that with a friend, I think would also be powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm totally, I mean, as someone with a sister, an older sister, I totally agree.
Yeah, it feels like a the more natural path, but I think building out those resources, asking for like help is not easy. And I think the more people you have in your corner to do that, um, is really helpful. One one of like strategies my friends and I do, we call them it's called positive polls. And so we would like if we were out, we would do like positive polls. Everyone's got to say something they love about the person and they write, take a drink of whatever they're drinking, and like pass it on to the next person. And it was always like fun, and like and sometimes there's like random people in it, and it's like medium awkward, but it's so fun. It's usually if we're out and about at a bar. And it's not every time, but it is like a really cool way to like break down and it's like barriers and be like, hey man, like I like love this about you, like you're this to our group, and it just kind of helps build bonds. So I don't know. That's something we've been doing the past few years, especially as we don't like we see each other. It goes from like weeks to like months, and like now it's like a couple times a year, maybe max. We'd all get together, and so it just becomes more and more important, I think, to kind of do things to maintain those bonds.
Yeah. It's even like, even as you're saying that, I'm imagining doing it with my friends and I'm like, oh, this would be weird kind
That
of.
would be it's so weird. It's so
Yeah.
weird. And I think it helps because it's usually if we're like out drinking, like it's literally called positive pulls. Like pull
Yeah.
it used to be
Yeah.
pulls with a handle. We don't do that anymore because we're too old, but now it's just take a drink of whatever beer you're having. But it is fun, and it helps to build the bonds. And I think part of breaking down uh, some of that element where like friendships based purely on like experiences, like whether it's a certain trip or activity, it's hard to get deeper than that specific trip or activity, and kind of loses strength if you're not maintaining the frequency, which just gets hard to do as everyone's working and getting older. And so I think
Yeah.
that's why guys struggle a bit sometimes with like with experience-based friendships. Like we all went from places of making friends at school with like structures where we see each other every day, and then that falls apart, and it takes some extra changes and work to maintain them.
Definitely. I mean, maintain relationships as you get older. Like you have to be much more deliberate about it
Hmm.
for sure. I also think like the positive pulls game activity is definitely pretty great because it kind of forces that out of you. But I also think like most people, myself included, would be pleasantly surprised by their friends' reactions to some sort of like emotional vulnerability for other guy
Hmm.
friends. Like I've had a couple instances in my life where I've just like felt, we all have things that happen in our personal lives that, really uh like life all like, really like tragedy strikes everyone at some point. And every time I've sort of had to go to a friend or made myself vulnerable to a friend, I've been pleasantly surprised. So I would encourage everyone to, reach out to friends in the time of need. And I think most would be pleasantly surprised by the reactions, even if it's not a sort of regular thing like positive polls. Although that of course makes it easier when you have like sort of a routine of talking positively to your friends. It makes
Mm-hmm.
every instance of doing so that much easier. But generally speaking, I think people are always happy to be helpful
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I think it's a
just
helpful exercise to, like you said, if you put yourself in the shoes of a friend, like I personally am honored, like if someone comes to me for help, that they would like trust me and be
yeah,
vulnerable. And so I think if you kind of put yourself in like what would I feel if that person came to me with help for this or that, that they would probably react positively and like be grateful to have your trust and want to help as a friend. And it just takes that initial bridge of the gap. So I like the exercise of like the mental exercise of putting yourself in their shoes and be like, okay, how would I react? And if I would react positively, then they would probably as well. And so it kind of can like grease the friction for that initial approach for that, which I think can be tough.
yeah, 100%. Just not something like we do on a regular
Yeah.
basis, and so
Yeah. I mean, and
doesn't
that's
take
part of the,
much.
that was, excuse me, that was part of like the initial premise of Under the Hood Talk is like, just has seen content online of guys sharing and talking through like mental health challenges or wellness challenges and how other guys overcame it or built this bond or used this technique would just get make it more normal to have those kind of conversations. So it might not be some like earth shattering change, but just making it more like familiar. And getting, I think having the right language can be helpful too, to like describe certain feelings or situations to share between guys is helpful. um and just like more resources, like we've just been starting to build out like our resources page, like certain tools or products or retreats or men's groups or like ways. Maybe I'll put positive polls on there. I don't know how healthy that be, but I think having things like that is like, hey, here's what you can do to like reach out to a friend or like reach out to a friend you haven't talked to in 1 year or 3 years, or like reconnect from this person from your time past school. So I think there's ways that you could like um provide tools to like reinitiate those like early connections.
Yeah, for sure. Like I like in an ideal world, everyone would do those things, but it's helpful to have tools to sort of like nudge you along.
Hmm. Yeah,
But yeah, it's a
exactly. I
great.
like
I
it.
think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I'll have to start working on that. The other thing I was going to ask you, um, you mentioned a bunch like your family environment, and particularly your dad, and like providing a model and for like what the confident or the competent confidence is, or like mentor a model of like what masculinity is to you now. I wonder if you have any examples of like what you would want to pass on to your kids in terms of values, or something that's stuck with you as like a mentor that you think could be helpful to share.
Do you mean like in terms of like being whatever, like being a man, or just in general, like lessons to pass on to the next generation, like of my family?
I guess, I mean, either one. I think just hearing about um how the model or mentorship of fatherhood is helpful to hear in a bunch of different contexts. So yeah, if there's a lesson you learned or something that helped you ground to like, okay, this is what it means to be a man, I think would be cool to share widely.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever had explicit conversations with my dad about like what it means to be a man. It was sort of more learned by action. I mean, he would say things like, you're gonna have to take care of your mom and your sister, or like you know, he definitely reinforced the idea of like being the head of the family is not the right word, but you know, sort of like the buck stops. At least in our family, the buck sort of stopped with him, and my mom and my dad like split um caretaking roles, and it's not like one of them did more than the other, but it was sort of like in most scenarios, like kind of the buck stopped with him. But what I would want to pass on, I think, is just like taking care of people that like mean a lot to you. Like every Sunday when I was a kid, my dad and I would drive to my grandmother's house and like drink Dunkin', like have Dunkin' Donuts and drink coffee and just like hang out and
Mhm.
chat. And just sort of like that act of like being there for my grandmother and being supportive and giving her something to look forward to like every week was like something that like really taught me what it means to like be like someone's family and how to be supportive.
Mhm.
So I think like when I have kids, my relationship with my like I'm always going to make sure that they have a front row seat to seeing the way that like I treat my mom and I treat my dad. Because I think those are like the things you learn early on from your parents, and then you go out into the world and like treat the rest of the people in the world that way. Um, so really like it was just being supportive of the rest of our family and like trying to
Mhm.
make sure everyone always wants like is pushed and is encouraged to like be the best version of themselves. Like, you know, I don't think my dad really treated me or my sister very differently. He was kind of like, both of you try really hard, do as best as you possibly can in all of your endeavors, and like life's gonna be fine for you. Pursue your goals, try really hard, and like I'm gonna do everything I can to sort of enable your success. And I think, you know, I'm not ready to have kids anytime soon, but when I think about the lessons or the way that I want to support them, it's probably like in a very similar way.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great example. I was just talking to my grandparents or FaceTime with my grandparents this morning, and they were telling me how my dad visited them yesterday for like 2 hours, and so I think it's such a great example of like taking care of like the people who took care of you, um, and it's such a good like character reflection, like kind of honoring that, and then also like you said, just being present, like with you and your sister, because I think I would agree. I don't think I had an explicit conversation with my dad like, "Hey son, like this is how you go be a man," but it's
Yeah.
shown through actions and it's shown through time and just a presence there, taking the time to like just sit and be and have those conversations. And so I think I would for sure agree with you on that. It's more of like the vibe and the presence and the safety and the security that role provides, as opposed to like any explicit like Ten Commandments list.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think I was also really lucky in that, like, I think I I know people whose parents or dad kind of subscribe to like a different brand of masculinity that I think, you know, you could define as like toxic or not as, that's more associated with like the physical bravado or like being manly, like whatever that means. So I think and it sounds like you as well, we're really lucky growing up with people that, again, it's not about like your physical stature, it's just about like physical, you know, being there for people
Yeah,
is like the really most important thing.
yeah,
uh
and that also goes back to the core of like under the hood talk is like masculinity is for everyone in the sense of like it's all shapes and sizes and voices and backgrounds and demographics, and I think like media, society, literature, whatever does like a pretty poor and narrow job of like saying this is what a man should be, and it's a all external when it really should just be a like a collection of positive traits, behaviors, characteristics that like make the people around them feel supported.
yeah, totally agree. Your comment about being portrayed in the media as external, I think is right on.
Yeah, yeah, and
Although there's like, it seems like in recent years there's like a reversal trend of that, which is
for
which
sure.
is probably a good thing. But I agree for the most part. It's really like portrayed in the external way, which is not the greatest way, I think, to get people to exhibit the kind of masculinity that's like good for society,
Yeah,
which is teaching your kids how to behave and treat their family. And
yeah. And it gives people like nothing to work towards, because if the model, if like the model of masculinity that you're supposed to work towards is like the Superman in the movie, then if you don't look like that, there's just absolutely nothing to work towards and improve on. So I think making masculinity more nuanced in terms of like various traits that you can exhibit gives everyone something to work towards, regardless of like how you present in the world.
yeah, it's interesting because like it's hard to portray those things in the media because it's like, right, like what we're talking about with your dad or my dad, it's like enabling your family, to go out into the world in a healthy way and like attack problems head on. And like in the superhero movie, he's like sort of like a physical. Superman is just an example. There's a lot of like male characters, and I'm not. Superman is just one example of this. Like his physical stature is like kind of a representation of the ideas that we're talking about, like a physical manifestation of that, and that can often be like really easily misconstrued.
Mm-hmm.
Is the problem,
Yeah.
right? Like Superman is his whole thing is like saving the world,
Mm-hmm.
um, and like being this physically strong person, but also, like I just think it's lost on people that the physical representation is like speaking to something so much more. But oftentimes it's misconstrued.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. A lot of the positive qualities and traits can be in those books and movies, but are kind of just lost in the translation of like, oh, it just must be because of the way he looks that he's able to accomplish all that. So that's
Yeah.
an interesting point. Well, I know I only took half an hour from you. It's 5 p.m. and I just want to say I really appreciate you coming on to share with Under the Hood, and it was really great to reconnect. And I'd love to catch up in New York and talk about lots of other things beyond just your views on masculinity.
Yeah, man. No, it was great to chat with you. It's good
Yeah.
to.
So what do you think it means to be a good man?
I don't think there's a single definition.
Things that make up a good man are just the things that make up a good person. Someone who's honest, someone who's decent.
You're also willing to express yourself in a healthy way, and you're in touch with your emotions as well.